Thanks so much, Evan, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you could all join us for today's Funder to Funder conversation on investing in the future, exploring the ways in which philanthropy can advance strategic public financing to support children's early school success. As many of you know, for the past several years, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading has used its GLR Learning Tuesdays and Funder to Funder conversations to follow the data on learning loss, lifting up bright spots and silver linings that could inform efforts in communities across the country to slow, stop, and reverse learning loss. We've used our webinars to call for smart investments of ARPA and ESSER dollars to drive equitable learning recovery in the wake of the pandemic. Earlier this year, we launched a new series of webinars called Big Bets Working to shine a light on the incredible progress made in many communities where smart investments of these public dollars in things like high-impact tutoring, powerful out-of-school time learning programs, scaling of digital connectivity, and leveraging of ed tech for teaching and learning, and evidence-based strategies to reverse the crisis of chronic absenteeism have delivered measurable results for kids. That series will continue in the coming months and will include investigations of what it takes to scale and replicate these smart investments, because we know that despite this incredible pockets of success that we've seen, not all of the efforts have worked as well as we had hoped, and they certainly did not reach as many children and families in as many places as we had hoped. As we now face the impending federal cliff of ESSER dollars coming this fall, with national data showing that many students continue to lag behind pre-pandemic levels and gaps that have widened, we need to ensure that we are effectively leveraging existing public funding streams and looking for opportunities to generate additional public funding to support young children and families. So today's conversation will lift up examples of where and how philanthropy is taking action to identify and align existing funding streams, generate new revenue, and implement strategies to administer funds in ways that maximize their impact. Their stories are powerful and inspiring, and also actionable. So to begin that conversation, I'm honored to welcome and introduce our amazing panel for today, sharing just very brief bios for each of them, and I'll drop a link to their bios in the chat in just a second so you can learn more about each of them. Welcome first to Todd Batiste. Todd serves as the Senior Vice President for Education and Youth Initiatives at the United Way of Southeast Louisiana in New Orleans, where he's responsible for formulating, directing, and managing priorities, strategies, and implementation of initiatives within the United Way's education impact area. As a part of that work, Todd played a lead role in Yes for NOLA Kids, New Orleans' successful 2022 campaign to secure additional city funding for early learning. Welcome also to Heather Flaherty. Heather serves as the Executive Director of the Chuckanut Health Foundation in Whatcom County, Washington State, where she applies her experience in healthcare administration, business management, and community health. She played a lead role in a 2022 county ballot initiative generating additional funding to support children in Whatcom County. Welcome also to September Jarrett. September serves as a program officer in education at Heising Simons Foundation, where her work focuses on policy and systems change in California. These efforts also include a role in working with Heising Simons Action Fund, a 501c4 social welfare organization, separate entity that was founded in 2020. In a previous role, September helped develop the Child Care Facilities Fund of the Low Income Investment Fund, an award-winning public-private partnership designed to expand the supply of high-quality early care and education facilities. And welcome also to Trevor Stores. Trevor serves as the president and CEO of Alaska Children's Trust in Anchorage, Alaska, where he applies his nearly 3 decades of experience in advocacy, innovation, and community engagement to the organization's efforts to ensure children and families have access to the knowledge, skills, support, and resources to thrive. He played a lead role in Anchorage's successful 2023 Yes on 14 Care for Kids campaign. And to guide us through today's conversation, welcome to our moderator, Elizabeth Gaines. Elizabeth brings an incredible knowledge and expertise to this topic. She's the founder and CEO of Children's Funding Project, where for 6 years she has applied the knowledge and skills built over a 25-year career in child advocacy, including the growing awareness that adequate resources were not being directed to children. Thank you to all of our panelists. I'm excited to hear what you all have to share, and I'll pass it over to you now, Elizabeth.
All right. Thanks so much, Sarah. Really excited about this conversation. Some of my favorite people and favorite community campaigns are on the webinar today. As Sarah said, I'm Elizabeth Gaines. I'm the CEO and founder of Children's Funding Project, and we're an organization that really came into existence after sort of a career of money being at the center of many of the challenges that I faced throughout my direct service or advocacy or support with technical assistance to states and communities career. And so I, really think that there's an opportunity here. And one of the things that we are particularly trying to do is reach as many folks in philanthropy as we can with this message that there is work to be done to engage in public financing, because what we've learned through our fiscal mapping over the years is that the lion's share of the resources to support our children and youth and their development come from the public sector. And so we need to be attending to making those systems as equitable, coordinated, and sustained as possible. And so philanthropy has a real role to play in that. And so love this topic of this conversation. So, but Sarah, thanks for doing it. If you want to go to the next slide. This is just to give you a sense of, as we formed as an organization, we've really tried to put a little bit of discipline toward us child advocates, right? So our team is made up of, former after-school program providers like me, doulas, teachers, social workers, and we've sort of self-taught on really trying to answer these three questions. And we focus in on the state, community, and Native Nations levels, because we think that's where, folks are really most ready to roll up their sleeves and get involved in this stuff. And you'll hear some really compelling examples of that in a moment. But so we help people to answer these three simple questions that one would think we know the answer to in this country, but we tend not to know. So how much funding is currently supporting our goals for kids right now in our communities? What are we spending across all the different levels of government and departments that have some sort of a focus on child and youth well-being? We do that through fiscal mapping, which you've probably heard me say at some point. How much will it cost to fund our goals in full? So this is that notion that we've, for a long time, sort of gone into situations, quote unquote, asking for or demanding funding that didn't actually equate to the amount that we would need to serve children and youth in the ways that we know are going to work. So we're really trying to help people put the real numbers out there and be very clear where those numbers came from. So that's what we call cost modeling and sometimes cost estimation. And then how do we fill the gap between the current funding that we've just measured and fully funding our goals that we know it's going to take? That's where we really, I think, have seen some exciting new success, and where we're going to focus the conversation today. So how do we generate new public revenue to fill these big gaps that we have in how we serve our children? So that's what we're going to talk about. Each one of these panelists has really, been embarking on this journey with us for some time. They didn't just sort of wake up one day and land on a ballot and ask the voters to do what they're going to tell you about. They really got into this by, exploring some of these questions and trying to get a full handle on what the full funding picture looks like for kids. So there's too many sort of assets that we have to tell you about in each of these places, but Allie on our team is going to put into the chat some of the things that they've done at the state level to map funding, the local level to map funding, cost modeling work that they've done. There's a whole bunch of assets that you can take a look at on your own time. But the one thing we are going to focus in on today is this notion of a voter approved children's fund. And when we started 6 years ago, there were quite a few of these that existed in pockets around the country, just sort of sprung up of their own accord everywhere from Florida to California. we think it's a really important mechanism to explore, because with that local funding comes a certain level of responsiveness that you can't get from federal and state funding. It also provides a real infrastructure at the local level to be ready should things like, oh, I don't know, a pandemic happen, right? When you've got a local infrastructure in place, you're really able to organize more quickly, move dollars out when they need to be moved, and innovate in those ways. I mentioned the public funding piece. We just are really convinced that we've got to do more to push on the public funding side. It can't be done by private philanthropy alone. Moving private philanthropy into ways to really use their dollars to do the innovation and to do the advocacy and to do some of these other pieces. Dedicated to kids is important. We really think that the voters have a very clear head about wanting to see resources go straight to kids, and so we believe that that's the best way to approach this at this time. And then the ballot is important, because not only does it secure for future and sustained investment over time, but it also builds this sort of grassroots children's movement from the ground up, which you'll hear about in these 3 places. So if we hop to the next slide, I think I want to, well, we can pull the slides down, actually. I'm going to turn first to Todd. We're going to go in order of them passing, but Todd Batiste at United Way is going to share a little bit about the journey that they've been on in New Orleans, and I'm thrilled to hear what you have to say, Todd. So why don't you just share a little bit about the story?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Todd Batiste, I serve as Senior Vice President for Education with United Way of Southeast Louisiana. And typically when I speak, I use what I call the 3 Bs: to be brilliant, to be brief, and to be gone. I have a tendency to be long-winded when speaking on subjects that I'm passionate about, but I'll give you a little context around how United Way got involved in this work. United Way for Southeast Louisiana's goal is the eradication of poverty in Southeast Louisiana. We recognized that was a lofty goal, and we realized policy and advocacy was one opportunity for increased investments. Systems change has always been a priority, and because we also recognized that we did not have an endless pot of funds, a pot of gold, it was important for us to tap into public financing. That was critical. We started our journey on this road of improving access to early childhood education back in 2007, when we advocated for the implementation of what we call the Louisiana School Readiness Tax Credit. That's a tax credit for child care centers that have, it's a tax expense credit for parents who place their child in child care centers participating in the state's quality rating system. It's a tax credit for child care providers that participate in our quality rating system. It's also a tax credit for center directors and staff that's working in child care centers. And we were unique in putting a tax credit in for businesses that support child care centers. Subsequent to that tax credit, we worked at the state level to create Louisiana's Early Childhood Education Fund. This is a state matching fund that offers local parishes in Louisiana a dollar-to-dollar match on investments made to expand access to quality early childhood education for children. The dedicated sources of revenue comes from what we call sports betting. We have about 20 million that's going into the fund. Our Pelicans, the basketball team, 50% of our license plate revenue goes to the fund. Land-based casinos, we have about 3.6 million going into the fund. We have hemp CBD, 3% of that revenue goes to the fund, and fantasy sports betting, we have about 8% going into the fund. Last year, Louisiana made a historic $40 million one-time investment in the fund. In addition to reoccurring dedication, this investment was a step in the right direction. But in 2023, the legislature had an opportunity to allocate 10% of the recognized state access fund to the fund to continue supporting youngest children in Louisiana's community. We are working aggressively right now to secure that investment. With the state investment, research and data on the importance of early childhood education, we launched the campaign to get we launched the campaign to get into the city budget to increase the number of kids with access to our City Seats program. In 2018, we secured $750,000 in the city budget. In 2019, we secured an additional $1.5 million in the city budget. And in 2020, we doubled that. We got $3 million to invest for our kids in New Orleans. Those funds were used to pay the tuition costs for private early childhood education programs for kids who could not afford them. But as Elizabeth mentioned, the 2020 pandemic caused a huge economic downturn that impacted businesses, including childcare. The mayor said that she would have to cut that $3 million investment to 1.5 unless voters approved a set of ballot initiatives that would rearrange a group of existing property taxes. So in 2021, the proposed plan put ECE against the library. We knew that that was not a good idea, but how can you tell the mayor no? And the plan failed. Fortunate for us, the mayor did put the $3 million back in the budget. However, we wanted that investment. Thanks to the good advice of our friends at the Children's Funding Institute and other advocates, we launched the Yes for NOLA Kids campaign in 2022 and secured $21 million in dedicated funding for early childhood education. That created 1,500 early childhood seats in New Orleans. So as you can see, we said yes to New Orleans kids. There was a lot of experiences that we had going through that process. We've had some battle scars, but we were resilient, and we are now, right now, implementing our Yes for NOLA Kids campaign with $21 million in dedicated funds to support kids in New Orleans. We have a lot of work to do. We will continue to maintain that fund, but the fund at the state level is experiencing some anticipated cuts that I'm sure we'll talk about in terms of how we're planning to move forward with making certain that we have those increased investments. I hope I was brilliant.
No,
I know
you
I
were
was brief, now I'm gonna be gone.
all three of those B's, but don't be gone because we're going to come back to you. There's many nuggets I want to pick up on there. And one to be thinking about is the fact that you're sitting in a united way, right? And so let's make sure we circle back to that in the discussion, because there's a lot of folks on the line who are in united ways in their own communities and how they could, get engaged and play a role. So I want to turn next. I think in the chronological order of these things passing would be Heather. And so Heather Flaherty has been really at the forefront of an effort in Whatcom County, Washington, and can tell us more about what's gone on there.
Good morning. Pardon me. Goodness. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you today. I am located in Bellingham, Washington, which is in Whatcom County, on the very northwest corner of the contiguous United States. And our health foundation, I'm with the Chuckanut Health Foundation. Our vision is that every child gets a healthy start and every person receives the care they need throughout their lifetime. And so everything that we do is trying to get kids a healthy start in our community. For probably over a decade, even before my time as executive director, there have been discussions in our community about what would it look like, what could it look like if there was an opportunity to support kids in that really vulnerable early years of birth to 5. And we all had this recognition that when kids go to kindergarten, there's at least typically a public school system and a community of support around them and resources. But when you have a baby in our community, it's often, good luck. And then looking at the data and the outcomes for kids and the disparities and the shortage of childcare, and particularly our kindergarten readiness scores, that's something that in our community health world, we look at a lot as a proxy measure for how well did we take care of kids and families from ages birth to 5. And in our community, only half of our children are showing up to school ready to learn. And it's also a forward-looking measure because we know that if kids make it to kindergarten ready to learn, then they have a much better shot at a third grade reading level and high school graduation rates and success for the rest of their life. So we dreamed about public support for kids for a long time. And then we had the great privilege of meeting Elizabeth and the Children's Funding Project and actually attending a conference in Denver about how to create public funding streams in 2019. And a team met to do that and to go from Whatcom. And it was at that conference that we looked at each other and said, oh my gosh, this is possible. There's a playbook here. We know that there's support. And so we really leaned on the Children's Funding Project to engage in all of those steps to create public will, starting with the fiscal mapping. We'd already been doing quite a bit of coalition building over the years, informally and formally. And then we did some fiscal mapping and funded that as a health funder to really look at the childcare shortages and what would it take to close the gap. We're 5,000 slots short. We did that demand study. So we just really did all of the foundational research work to make sure we were on solid ground in all of our campaign messaging. The other thing we did as a funder that I think is important for you to know is we were very intentional about community leadership and not tipping the scales as a funder and just really being conscientious of that power differential. And so there was a community group that came together to actually write the ordinance. I'd love to put the ordinance in the chat too. I can put the link in when I'm done sharing. And so it's a community written ordinance and ballot measure. And so it's really focused on community priorities. And we also very much asked our local government to do government differently. And so we built in requirements for transparency and accountability and overlapping opportunities for community to be engaged and understand where the fund's going and requirements for evaluation. So we actually know what is the impact, how many more childcare slots are built because of this fund. We don't have very many options for creating funding streams in Washington state. And so we went with a millage. It was a 19 cents per $100 or $1,000 assessed value for property owners. Not super popular. And I would say one thing you should do if you can as a funder is fund the polling to help you understand how much work you have to do to bring your community along and what messages resonate the most. And it's so interesting looking back at the polling. It was very, very accurate. It was very much a 50-50 split. And we also took the route of asking our Whatcom County Council to vote to put it on the ballot rather than the signature initiative route. There's pros and cons to that path, and we might get into that later. And I'll tell you too that for a long time there was a debate. There were a couple of debates with our providers and our community members and our parents and family members about what would this fund, and also should we do Bellingham, the city only, or the whole county? And with support and facilitation, the ordinance will show you what we decided to fund. We just said, you got to increase childcare, make it affordable, high quality, professional, and accessible for all families. And also more support for vulnerable children. We wanted funds that could prevent homelessness and also support mental health and behavioral health in those really early prenatal years that are so critical for brain development. And there was a strong value of wanting to go countywide because we believed that continuing to only invest in the city of Bellingham would just only create more disparities across the county. So moving into campaign mode, I'll close with this, that it was a wild ride. There is a great playbook though for how to do it all. And you do have to do it all. And it was just kind of eat, sleep, breathe there's a fantastic team. You don't do it alone. You can't do it alone, but you got to have a great team. And on election night, we were actually down by just over 2,000 votes. It was really crushing. And then there were about 10,000 ballots left to count, though. So every night the team would get together and refresh, wait for the auditor to count those ballots. And the gap kept getting smaller and smaller. And finally, there was a gap of 293 votes. We were down by 293 after like the fifth or sixth count. And we saw that there were about 950 rejected ballots, which can happen when your signature in Washington State, it's a mail-in ballot system. And if your signature doesn't match on the ballot, it can get rejected. And so we moved into a ballot curing phase, which is really kind of unique and interesting. And on the very last possible day, we won by 20. So that was 22, and now we're into implementation, and excited to share more about that. So thanks for hearing our story up here in Whatcom.
Thanks, Heather. And as folks can tell, this is not for the faint of heart, right? You have to have a thick skin. And there's many stories to be told over long, cups of tea about each of these, individual campaigns. But remembering that we're actually doing this for our youngest, most vulnerable citizens makes, I think, it worth the effort that we're putting in here. So, Trevor, let's talk about Anchorage and Alaska. People didn't think we could go further west, but we will. Tell us.
North, west and north. Well, good afternoon, and/or if anybody's in Alaska, good morning. We're 4 hours behind Eastern time here. I just want to say that much of what Heather and Todd shared is similar to Alaska in the sense of common themes. One is Children's Funding Project. Talk about not just a playbook, but actually telling you that you could do this, and motivation. I just met Elizabeth. Heard about her. I was in DC, met with them, and next thing I know is a couple of weeks I went to their first gathering. I was like, "Can I come?" She's like, "Well, if you pay for it." I said, "Sure," and just showed up and was just in awe. And really, what they started reinforced with me, I already knew this, but they really said it is so many times as organizations where I always think we're under the table fighting for the scraps, and these for-profit organizations, like up here in Alaska, oil is big, the oil companies are on top enjoying all the feast, and we're only happy to get any of the scraps. And I'm like, there isn't anything preventing me from being on top. What do we need to do that? And one of the things I will say for us was really getting our board understanding that and being willing to take a risk. Going out there and putting yourself front and center as an organization. People may be happy, and/or when you start talking about whether taxes or taking money, and depending where you're at, we are a red state. Anchorage is about 45% of the the Alaska population. It's not a big population in Alaska, big state, but small population. And more purple, but still it can create some interesting issues and/or challenges. And it was really helping our board get comfortable with that. And we've been doing that over time with just around advocacy. So when it actually came to the idea of doing a ballot initiative, the board was ready and prepped. We didn't go from 0 to 60. It was really taking a lot of time and nurturing of our board as an organization. And with that, when we could show that we were willing to do it, then others would follow. And what we did was, we actually had an existing tax. We were the second state in the nation to legalize recreational marijuana. And we went for the local tax here in Anchorage to be dedicated to childcare and early childhood development education. And we did that, one, because trying to get a new tax can be a little iffy, especially as we were coming out of COVID and people were just uncertain about money. And then we also specifically will say thank you to COVID, that childcare became a really hot topic and it wasn't a hard sell. So timing is important in really gauging things. Of course, like Heather talked, we did the polling, coalition building, as Todd talked about, all of those things. But it was really, it does sometimes come down to timing. And we have been talking about it for several years. And so when the timing was right, we're ready. Don't wait for the timing to start. So when the timing happens, you're ready to go. You're ready to perform instantly. And that's what we were able to do. And then lastly, one of the things that we did was, well, two things that we did was really appreciate, Heather talked about that community transparency. I will tell you, communities don't want to give government money and no explanation of why and or accountability. I think that's where many of our governments are missing the boat, is people are lacking the trust in them, not because they're government, because they're not doing a good job of being transparent and open communication. And we really wanted to do that. And transparency was going, we want money and this is what it's going to go to. We created those bumpers so they didn't feel like it was a blank check just going back into the government system. And it was going to something that the community needed and wanted. Nothing that a politician thought, nothing that just a singular individual. It was truly community owned. And polling told us that, as well as the communication and so forth. And the last thing I want to share is we were able to get ours passed because we really thought strategic. We are definitely left-leaning, if you want to say Democrat. However, in local government, there is no parties. But let's be honest, we think the way we think, and we needed to think differently. And one of the ways we did that was we hired a consultant that was right-leaning, that could come in, talk to us about our language, open doors we couldn't. We really developed a partnership to make sure that we weren't just thinking like ourselves, and really being open to that feedback. And that is definitely a strategy that really opened up not just doors, but really formed some relationships that I don't think we would have had without them going, oh, that's nice, but my people wouldn't believe that or listen to that. They won't hear that. And it's like, oh, what is the language that we need, or what do we need to do different? And really made it nonpartisan. And that's the way you achieve that. And we were able to get it. We're small in size, so our money was small. It's just $5 million. But for us, it was a huge step, especially in our community. We've never done this. This was the second time we've done a designated fund. First one was actually a couple years before we joined a ballot initiative and got an alcohol tax passed and helped do some funding around prevention work, and that involved early childhood development work. But this was very specific. And so our community wasn't used to doing this. So this was a really big feat, that not only did we have the alcohol and now this, and we're really seeing positive communication from the community. It's not a full bucket, but it's a nice pour that maybe we can prove to the community this stuff works. And we can go back and ask for more, and people are willing to give it because the trust is there and the impact is being shown.
Love that story, and you guys did really do some interesting things to make sure that your approach was one that would resonate with as many of the constituents in your community as possible. So I think that's really smart. Let's turn now to September Jarrett, who is a dear friend and supporter of all of this work, and at the Heising Simons Foundation, but for the purposes of this conversation, also with the Heising Simons Action Fund. So September, you all have been, and by the way, there's some good questions in the Q&A about, is this just about early childhood? I will say, from a Children's Funding Project perspective, we are trying to really work the whole cradle to career spectrum here on this securing public resources for kids. But yes, some of these early wins have been in the early childhood space, and a lot of that is thanks to Heising Simons Action Fund. So September, do you want to talk to us about how bold your benefactors got in doing this work?
Thanks so much. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, grade level reading. Heather, Trevor, Todd, gosh, you're amazing leaders, and I'm really honored to join this conversation. I'm talking to you as a program officer and funder from our foundation and action fund, building on 20 years of experience as a children's funding leader myself here in my hometown, San Francisco. And I'm excited to share and climb into the conversation. There's a really critical role for philanthropy, whether from a foundation lens or an action fund, social welfare grant making lens, to accelerate the progress of the field in children's funding. Let me start with sharing a little bit about Heising-Simons Action Fund. We were established in 2020. We're funded by the Heising-Simons family, and we're governed by a 5-person board. The Action Fund really works to build a better world through several areas of focus and change, including climate and clean energy, human rights, technology and society, and last but not least, education. For us at Heising-Simons, education is focused on the critical first years of life, from birth to 8 years old. And we know and hold that young children grow up to be young adults and adulthoods, and do support flexibly birth to cradle innovation in the financing field. Our North Star goal for the education program is to vastly increase public investment in early childhood field, and we work at the federal, state, and local levels. We have a special focus here in California, our home state, and local work. We approach the work of increasing investment in children with 2 major grant making tactics that focus on building the capacity of the field. First, we focus on building technical capacity of field leaders in community and in government to know and advance best practices in financing and governance. We fund field leaders to work on such things as fiscal mapping, cost modeling, analysis of promising revenue funding streams to meet community needs, as well as impact evaluation for those proof points that are successful. We also work to build the political infrastructure and the power of the early childhood field to ensure that funding is prioritized and invested in consistently over time to make a difference in children's lives. We center relationships in our grant making and take a field building approach. We seek to provide, whenever possible, flexible long-term funding to field leaders working in the national, state, and local space. Since our foundation's inception in 2007, we've been a policy and systems change funder with a focus on financing, and we've funded a number of promising things both historically and today, such as public education and narrative change, funding local coalitions and collaborations. We've funded parent and provider organizing to make sure these experts are centered in policy and practice change, and we support evaluation and impact analysis. But over the years, we hit a limit in wins using only our private foundation strategy, and the family sought bolder and bigger changes and greater investments in young children, and with that created the Heising-Simons Action Fund in 2020 with the specific goal of adding a new tool to our toolkit so that we could fund and support communities that were showing up and showing it out at the ballot to fight for greater investment in kids. We are proud to support a range of partners in the field, including children's funding projects through our foundation and Children's Funding Accelerator, our hosts here today, who are powerful partners in building both the technical and political capacity of local communities to fight and win investment in kids. Next slide, please. We take a bet on local dedicated funds for a range of reasons, and the panelists have really outlined the why and the impact. I'll say a few things, starting with being Captain Obvious here. Early childhood and youth services are woefully underinvested in the US, so we support dedicated funds to show the money and grow investments in children and communities. We also think it's really important to focus up front meet children and youth needs when they present instead of trying to and prevent harm or challenges when children and families are underinvested in. And I think Trevor's example from Alaska illustrates that. We really try and we support dedicated children funds because they're a structure and ability for communities to show up, show out, and shine a light on how systems are serving or not serving communities that can benefit from investment and services. We really increasingly, we entered this work to really center the growing investment in children and youth on what works in those critical early years, and we stand by that. But increasingly, we have seen that dedicated funds also create a vehicle, I guess, governance and accountability for communities to have a structure to mobilize, show up, and make sure that their systems continue to change, invest, and evolve to meet the needs of changing communities. And the COVID examples that were shared really showed that out. Last but not least, I would just say that dedicated children's fund really help leverage other funding sources. And I think in COVID, we saw the communities with organized and dedicated children's funds with wins on the books, able to draw down additional resources, COVID relief funds to bring into children and youth that wouldn't have been possible otherwise without the infrastructure of a fund. In the end, I would just say the results have been transformative for us. This is hard, long-term work with as many losses as wins, but when a win happens, the support for funds is durable. When funds go back to the ballot, they are renewed and increased over time. And I'll end with a powerful example here in San Francisco, my hometown. Multiple measures are resulting in a system which today, here, right now, is offering childcare with no wait list for subsidies with families earning up to $150,000. That's 3 measures over 20 years, making that happen. And public investment that's giving raises to early childhood educators and childcare teachers of $8,000 to $30,000 more a year, depending on qualifications. And so those are impacts that are proof points for larger transformation across the country and at the state and federal level. Thanks.
So awesome. And it's true, once a local funder gets the bug, they don't really want to stop, because say you make $100,000 investment in one of these campaigns and into perpetuity, sometimes you're talking about millions and millions of dollars guaranteed for kids over time. So it's about the best sort of return on investment that you can make as a local funder. So if you hop to the next slide, September mentioned the Children's Funding Accelerator, and I just wanted to say this explicitly for folks who are on the line from a variety of communities across the country. We don't want local funders to be thinking about this and going, oh boy, do I have to go it alone here in my community? There are supports, and Heather and Trevor and Todd all mentioned this, but we at Children's Funding Project provide technical assistance. We pull folks into a cohort that each of them participated in. The funder is, like Heather said, not necessarily the out front leader on this, but they are there supporting a team that includes, parents and advocates and policymakers. And so we run these cohorts that communities can be a part of as they pursue a certain measure on the ballot. And then they, through that process, have been applying, and they apply to the Children's Funding Accelerator to receive campaign support once they actually qualify for a ballot. So this is something that's available to communities. Please reach out to, it's really Olivia Allen on my team who is leading this work. And we're happy to tell you more about how that all works. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say about that. And and the other piece is that we do pull folks into these, I don't know if I mentioned, pull folks into this institute where you really get to interact with the communities that have done this, and it's almost like a boot camp. I know we're not supposed to use that word anymore, but it does feel a little bit like you're in an intensive session for a few days, really learning how to do some things that we just in our field don't practice very often. The polling and the political campaigns and the tax policy and things that we just don't spend enough time thinking about as a field. So wanted to make sure folks were aware of that. If you hop to the next slide, we're getting into the Q&A part here. So I do want to say, you know, we've been thinking, like I said, a lot about what is the role of private philanthropy in this strategic public financing space. And I think you've heard a lot from the panel here about some of those different ways that philanthropy has gotten involved. We've sort of boiled it down to these 4 things. I'm sure there are more, but the notion that you're either gathering people in your community to sort of say, hey, is this something we want to do here? You're building capacity on the ground to be able to understand those things that I just described in the boot camp, right? You are commissioning some of the research that's going to be needed so that you're really sharp when you go into these policy conversations about what you're asking for and how much it's going to cost and things like that. And then that you're really, you know, this is the part that gets, I think, the scariest for the funders, engaging in the public education and awareness raising and the polling and the messaging and the organizing in communities. So let's get to some of the questions I have real quick, and then I know there's a few that have come in the Q&A. So please, as folks are listening, put your questions into the Q&A and we will get to them. But let me just, you know, ask anyone who wants to share, you know, why do you think a funder should play an integral role in this work? What's the advice you have for why that's important to do?
I'll jump in, Heather. I mean, Elizabeth, I'm sorry.
Yes. Go ahead.
I think it leverages resources, and it also influences, we offer influences that support the importance of investing in education. A couple of things sort of resonated for me. We started with our early childhood millage and we were successful, but we also recognized that as kids transition from early childhood education into our K-12 system, there needs to be supports there to support them as well. So here in New Orleans, we have a Children and Youth Planning Board, and we were successful in getting some investments from our city to support the work of the Children and Youth Planning Board. So that is another opportunity, we think, to begin thinking strategically about getting more increased investments. For us, we have a board that, well, our COO is a lobbyist. So we understand that lobbying is important, and we set a policy agenda every year for our United Way. Not only do we get funds coming through the campaign, but we also write grants and secure funds to do the work that we're doing. And our Campaign for Grade Level Reading has a committee that does the same kind of work. So I think engaging leaders, and our board is very diverse. So instead of our board going up to Baton Rouge, the state capital, asking for taxes for oil or energy, they're going up saying early childhood education is important. We can't have a workforce if we don't have a strong childcare system. We need to have a future workforce, so we need to prepare them in early education. So in philanthropy, I think we play a major role because we have those partners. We have access to funding. Funds come through our United Way campaign to support the work that we're doing in the campaign. And we have other allies that work with us. The Policy Institute here in Louisiana, Agenda for Children, our child care provider network is extremely strong, and we were instrumental in engaging parents in this work as well. So parents were going out saying, this is important. I think
they were the face of the campaign, right? I mean,
yes.
It wasn't Todd at United Way. It was, you know, providers and parents and folks getting out there. Yeah. Right. So anyone else on that? And also I'll layer in what would be like getting started, dipping a toe in kinds of advice you'd have for folks.
Well, I think to build off top, why they should be involved is one, they're seen as leaders. People look to them, and if they're not engaging, that creates a question in people's mind. And more importantly, a lot of times people they wait until they see who is the first to contribute. And when you have a key funder in your community who's willing to stand next to you, and as I say, not just stand with you, but truly interlock arms with you, then other people are willing. People want to be part of the in-group, the winning group, however you want to look at it, so they can play a significant role in that sense. And the way they can start dipping their toe in it is, it doesn't always have to be, hey, we're giving you 50% of the total campaign. It can be just an initial, here's 25,000 and use as a match to create others. We've done different things, whereas, hey, we're putting in 50 and we'll put another 50 in if it's matched. And it just kind of grows. So there's different ways of dipping it in. And then I think lastly for foundations, it's really finding ways to educate your own board. Again, don't wait till you're asked and then explore if you're going to do it. Start having the conversation now, because the right time will just happen. And you as a foundation, no different than us as organizations, want to be ready at that moment and not after.
Yeah, that's super smart advice. Oh, go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I would just add too that I think funders have a really unique opportunity in that you often have a bird's eye view of the whole landscape of community need and all of the different partners that you could bring together. And when I think about childcare providers or our direct service providers, our frontline safety net providers, and the families and children that need these resources, they're not, it's really helpful if there's an organization that can help fund that coordination and make it the priority to build the public will, because your childcare provider is taking care of your kids. Your families are just trying to get by, and it's not fair to put the burden on them to do it by themselves. And so I think that funders have a responsibility and a really unique opportunity to help support with that backbone infrastructure.
Anybody want to say any nugget of advice around how to secure your board buy-in or key partner buy-in? I mean, Trevor, you sort of spoken to some of this, but I'd be curious if there's anything you all learned in the process of doing that.
Well, for us, the initial buy-in was just getting into the idea. If your board isn't used to this advocacy kind of work, just to start, you have to step into it, and we just built opportunities and made easy wins. So they saw the success and they could build, and they felt more comfortable with the challenges. And then lastly, one of the things I've learned is, as much as they rely on my expertise and my knowledge, I'm not a board member. And it's amazing, and we probably all experienced this. As I talk to my board, they're like, and somebody that they see as equivalent, a fellow board member comes in and speaks to it, says the same thing I just said, and they're like, oh my God, that's fabulous. Trevor, we need to do that. So sometimes it's creating those opportunities to board relationships. And I think the Children's Funding Project, if you can take board members to this boot camp so they can meet other board members and others and see that success, they get motivated, and then they see that it is a potential.
Yeah, we'd love to have them. We'd love to have them.
Now, add one thing, Elizabeth. We have a board, public policy chair on our board. So the board chair speaks to the agenda that we set up, and we bring in experts from across the field to talk to the board about the importance of the investment when we set our policy agenda for the year. We're anticipating next year being a fiscal year that there are going to be some potential cuts. And right now we have a governor that is somewhat different in terms of how he invests in children. So we're preparing to go up to Baton Rouge and advocate at least to maintain our current investment so that we don't lose anything. So, but I think the board chair, a public policy chair on the board, speaking to exactly what Trevor said to his colleagues, is received somewhat differently. But our COO does an amazing job of setting up that agenda for the board, and then our community also has an opportunity. Our partner agencies, they also have an opportunity to chime in on that policy agenda so that they see United Way is fighting for us across our spectrum of programs. Our successes have been across the gamut. I'm speaking on the success of education, but we've had other wins at the state level. Paid family leave, that was important to us. We were successful in securing that. So we do advocate, and we know that that's important. So I think the board.
Sounds like you're not coming out of left field at your board, like, hey, this is just some wild new thing we're trying, you're just bringing them along the entire time.
Right.
Yeah,
It's a
that's
part
awesome.
of our structure.
Great. Yeah.
Elizabeth, can I just briefly add a few things? From our board's perspective, we have been part of the field and making the case for investment in children and youth. And the evidence base has never been stronger, but the right time to invest in kids in the US often is has not yet achieved, right? Like it's, we don't have the right technical answer. It's too expensive. We don't have a proof point. And so for us really making the case, like the evidence base is strong, but the will is lagging. How can we lean in and with relatively small dollars from the foundation or action fund side have the biggest impact? And this was a space where communities knew and were mobilized, and a little bit of a resource goes a really long way. A few $100,000 when the win ultimately comes can be millions and hundreds of millions of dollars over time. So it's a high risk or feels new for many funders, but the upside is much greater when you kind of do the gap analysis. I would also say bringing board members along is important for them to hear from us in our professional capacities. But in my experience, there's nothing like hearing from an impacted community member, a parent looking for childcare, a youth without positive opportunities after school, as the best spokesperson and educator to bring a board along into this important community-led work. Thanks.
Without scaring people off from this conversation, give us like 2 sentences on IRS and why we should just feel okay about engaging in this as foundations. Anything you want to say, September, about that? Oh, did I freeze?
No, you didn't freeze.
September might have froze. September, either you don't want to answer my question about the IRS or you might have froze for a second. Heather, jump in if you have anything you want to say.
I can definitely jump in. Chaconut Health Foundation is a public charity. Some of you on the call may be public, some of you may be private. There are different rules. I would say, though, that there's a ton even private charities can do. All of that education before something's on the ballot is fair game. So public awareness, the research, even polling is something that you could fund. Obviously, talk to a lawyer. I think that's really great advice. And the other thing that helped my board was bringing Boulder Advocacy. That's an organization that's really amazing. Boulder Advocacy will come and do webinars and meet with your board to really go through like what's the green lights, what's the yellow lights, what's the red lights. So you all know that none of us can do candidates, and that's an opportunity with C4s, right? And that's kind of the bright line, but there's quite a bit of latitude on that public awareness and education side. And I wanted to add too, if it's okay, Elizabeth, what helped with my board getting them there was really taking just one step at a time and just like looking at the community data to see what are the highest needs, funding the fiscal mapping to understand the gaps. When we did that, it's not, we didn't say we're going to go straight from fiscal mapping to campaign. It was, let's understand this. Let's talk about this. Let's have community conversations about this. Funding the polling and understanding where the community's at, and then bringing the board together, bringing them along. Boulder Advocacy came, Children's Funding Project came. I think that showing examples across the nation that you're not actually the first one to go, and there's a role funders play that's legitimate, it's not scary, and then getting them all to vote wholeheartedly, yes, we're going to do this and we're going to do it together.
Yeah, I'm hoping that you all are providing inspiration for some funder who's listening right now. So I have more questions, but I think I'd rather make sure we get to these questions that are in the Q&A. So we can always circle back if we have time. But Charlotte asked a question: does CFP see this work need to play out any differently depending on whether you're focused on ECE versus out of school time for older youth? I just want to double down on that and say, We have seen a lot of early success with the early years, and communities and funders and others being like ready to dive in and work on it because there's such a dearth of funding in that space, and we have so much growth we need to do in this country. However, there are plenty of examples, and Allie can probably put a link to our map where we track the 50+ places around the country that have gone to the ballot and secured these kinds of resources for kids. And many of them focus cradle to career. Many of them focus in on things like comprehensive youth mental health services. There's a whole range of things that folks have done at the ballot for children and youth. So just wanted to make sure we shared that. How are the funds in each of your communities administered? Do they go to local government first? So maybe just a word from each of you on sort of the different ways. And this is where local matters, right? Like how you do it is designed locally. And so you want to talk about how that's happening in each of your spots. Let's go, Todd, Heather, Trevor.
Yeah, in New Orleans, the funds goes to our local resource and referral agency, Agenda for Children. And that was through a cooperative endeavor agreement. It had lawyers involved, making certain that it was written, it was clear. And one of the things the local R&R did that we were really excited about was as the funds started coming through, we provided our city council with monthly reports on where we were with getting this system up and going. One of the things I think we learned was we needed a longer runway because we had a lot of money, but we didn't have the capacity to serve the kids in the community. So we had to come up with creative ways to utilize those funds, creating infrastructure for childcare centers. We had issues with workforce, post-pandemic, finding individuals to work. So we incorporated a lot of those additional resources in the millage to get it up and going. But our local resource and referral agency right now manages those funds and reports to the city council on a monthly basis.
In our polling, actually, this came up, we polled specifically on fund administration, and just transparently in our community, there's a significant distrust in local government and in government generally. And we, in the ordinance drafting phase, explored, could we have an intermediary or set something up that it wouldn't have to be administered by the government. That's a heavy lift, and we weren't prepared to launch that at the same time as a campaign. And so what we wrote into the ordinance is that it was the fund administrator is the Whatcom County Health Department unless or until a better fund administrator is identified. So we wrote this sort of trapdoor clause so that there could be an opportunity for an intermediary to be stood up at some point. So that for now, it is our local government. And I will add that because of that, we doubled down on the requirements for transparency, evaluation, and community engagement. And in our ordinance, we limited the administrative costs. So we said you can only have 6% for administrative staffing, and then up to 3% for a biannual external evaluation of the funds.
For Anchorage, it's local government. That's the only way we could get the assembly and some key funders, or not funders, but leaders to be behind this. But that's fine. And we're actually now we're leading the process of devising the plan. So it won't be the assembly or department. There'll be a plan that actually dictates how best to use these dollars, that has a specific oversight board of leaders that's being formulated in this transitional group. And then they actually can use up to 10% for administration. It's one of the things that we found, that government doesn't always set the money aside, or it's always like on top of. And rather than trying to add, if we wanted to use these funds most effectively, we wanted to make sure the internal support was there. So we made sure that it was at least 10%.
Yeah. And please do, if folks have specific questions about how these are set up across the country, there's quite a range. And so there are a number of them run by nonprofits, and most of them have some sort of an oversight or advisory board, like you said, Trevor. So folks should know that. Okay, so then there was a question from Ben, thinking about the entire child and youth adult continuum. Do the panelists feel like a particular area is most ripe for voter approved children's funds, i.e., okay, so this is a bit of a similar question, but I guess September, you kind of talked a little bit about this in San Francisco, and we've seen this happen in a number of places where, you know, I know there are rumblings in Denver and in San Antonio, places where they've gone to the ballot and successfully, you know, gotten a pre-K measure passed. And now they're like, okay, how do we add in the next thing, which is, you know, out of school time, after school. And it does start getting folks sort of just in the practice of doing this so that they can move on to other areas. But I don't know if you or anybody else wants to add anything to that.
I would just climb in and say community context really matters. This is the work of communities, and some communities see a real gap around opportunity for positive activities for older youth and may start their campaign or fight there. Here in California, Sacramento, for example, has won a children's fund that really started with the youth activities and youth-led frame, and then it learned through the organizing and the process the power of also maybe considering early childhood as a component of that win. So I think it's really critical for folks on the call who know the priorities and needs of theirs communities to mobilize around them and make the case, whether it's youth, children, all of the above. And where you start isn't where you end. And Trevor showed us that, Todd showed us that. Mature communities start one place and I think grow the strategy and the opportunity to meet their community needs.
And to
Can I
that
add
point,
one thing, Elizabeth?
yeah,
I'm sorry. I would encourage them to conduct the research to understand the specific needs and challenges in their community, then identify those stakeholders and potential partners, including government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and community leaders, and develop a strategic plan that outlines the goals with objectives and measurable outcomes. Those are, you know.
hey, that's reasonable. That's great. Well, and I will say that, you know, all of the polling we've been involved in, whether nationally or locally recently, youth mental health and after school are off the charts in the voters' minds. I mean, they really are thinking about that stuff deeply. So relatedly, sort of, Angela's asking, was there any particular messaging that worked best for very conservative voters? And Trevor, I know you did some of this. I also want to say we supported a campaign in 2020 in Escambia County, which is you know, a very conservative area in that part of Florida. And some of the things that were unique and interesting were what we learned through the polling and through conversations with voters about things that they cared about. Child abuse and neglect was really high on the list of concerns compared to in other communities, maybe where it was more, you know, school readiness, or it was, you know, these other things. So I think there are sometimes those really unique things to a community that we just need to pay close attention to. But Trevor, what were some of the learnings from your?
Well, I hate to try to tell people use this message. The magic word that everybody's used is polling, polling, polling. Within your polling, you can ask them what are they most interested, whether it's early childhood or out of school or youth mental health. The community will tell you where they want to invest. But you can also then ask different messaging in what works, what resonates. That's really important. Don't make assumptions that you know. And then lastly, it's not always about the message, it's sometimes the messenger. If I was trying to speak to the far right, I could use the magic words, but they still weren't hear it. It needs to be somebody that they identify. So we made sure that we had a nonpartisan board leadership that was doing this. We had people on all sides able to talk. Same as if you're meeting with a bunch of mothers, don't send the father, send a mother, right? Same idea. So it is somewhat simple, but polling will get you the messaging and then find the right messengers.
Absolutely. Okay, Jorge has a question, Heather, for you about, and you mentioned this, you kind of decided to forego the signature gathering route. Anything you want to share about the process?
Yeah, to gather the signatures, it's very expensive and it's very labor intensive. And we were fortunate in Whatcom County we have 7 county council members, and we knew we had 4 votes to get on the ballot. So it was really just a decision of expediency and in retrospect, you know, what we've learned is that if it goes, and laws are different in different jurisdictions, so study up on your laws, but we have learned that when it's a councilmatic vote in Whatcom County, the council still has the power to change the ordinance post vote. And it's not, there's different strengths and weaknesses when it's a signature gathering initiative. You can't change it for a certain number of years. So it's really just length of time, the moment, striking in that opportunity moment, and whether or not you have the council support or you want to fund that signature gathering campaign. I will say that looking at other examples across the nation, the signature gathering campaign starts to build your public will in a really significant way too, and gets your voter base ready and activated. So I'm not at all discouraging that. So it's just trade-offs, I would say.
Yeah. Back on implementation, and Melissa asked the question that follows with something that I wanted to talk about a little bit with you all is, we tend to think like, okay, that election is the finish line, right? When in fact, it's sort of really the starting line. And then you've got to make sure that the funds are implemented well. Particularly, we're talking about taxpayer dollars. So we want to be good stewards. So we want to make sure, these things are being done well. How do funders stay engaged in that? And then Melissa's question was specific to sort of how funds are distributed, whether through a competitive grant basis or other ways. And it, I think, again, varies depending on which voter-approved children's fund we're talking about. But anything about how you all as funders are staying engaged in the implementation?
Well, in Alaska, we're actually leading the implementation. We knew there's this thing that I just remember my dad told me when I turned 16, got my first car. Buying the car is the cheap part, maintaining it is the expensive part. And I never understood that at first until, I got the car and like, oh, all the ongoing. Same, it may seem like a lot of work to get the ballot and, oh my God, you're putting X amount towards initiative. Then you want to maintain it. You want to make sure that it's being followed as expected, that it's truly being transparent. You want to prevent it from becoming a negative to the community and they repeal it, things of that nature. So we made sure that once it was done, it was like, all right, how is this going to be implemented? We weren't just leaving it to people that didn't know. So we put some money towards it and got the city to put money towards it to actually develop the initial plan made by experts, including people with lived experience at the table, which is really key to determine how best to use, which seems like a lot of money, but really it's not in the scheme of things.
I'll join in, and I really appreciate what Trevor shared. I think there's a saying that implementation eats policy for breakfast. These wins are huge and tremendous for communities. And in some ways, the win is just the beginning. When you have resources to deploy, whether it's a private partner or a public partner deploying it, it is typical to have more needs than resources, even when you win, number one. So deciding what to start with, how, what priority to fund first, and then how to fund. There was a comment in the Q&A. Is this typically done by proposal processes? Like, how do you administer funding? Often those are the kind of choices that communities make to have kind of a accessible but transparent grant making process. And then helping make sure community stays engaged and mobilized, not just in the win, but the design, the implementation, and the improvement of a children's fund. over time is a really critical place and role, where philanthropy has a sustained and continuing role. We can't sort of, help a win happen and then not pay attention to where and how the community is resourced to make sure it's implemented well. I will also say, in these kind of dynamic political times, wins are also sometimes questioned. So even when voters show up and show out for kids at the ballot box and resources start to flow, there are challenges sometimes to repeal children's funding measures. And so there's a role for philanthropy to help defend, for example, funding the documentation and the impact and first person stories so that the public stays supportive of the fund. And then sometimes even there's roles in, litigation and, mobilizing to make sure that investments that are made in children and youth are sustained through rocky political times.
And it's so interesting as this movement gains a foothold, and there is more of a movement to it. I do think we're facing more and more of those kinds of challenges, and so we have to be ready as a field and as particularly as funders to sort of defend these things. So, Todd, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that our situation is quite unique because our resource and referral agency serves 6 or 7 other parishes, and our United Way also serves those other parishes. The neighboring parish next to us is looking to get a similar millage. They're trying to get a similar investment in Jefferson Parish, which is neighboring us. The situation is totally different. It's a different dynamic. The polling is different. The relationships with the city council is different. And we're now working with those outlying parishes to help them build up their network to get increased investments so that they can draw down some of the money that's up in Baton Rouge to see to it that more kids have access to care. So our role is sort of shifting somewhat. Even though we're continuing to generate revenue for this work, we still support our New Orleans network in helping them maintain and build up what they need to build up, but they're acting as a thought partner with our outlying parishes to help them think about what could something similar look like in your respective parishes. So our work continues, and we're partnering with our local R&R. We have staff that serves on their board. Some of their members serve on our United Way board, so the relationship continues. And even though we have 21 million, the local R&R still ask us for additional funding to do other work. So we want to be a good partner, so we continue to support that work as we move on to see to it that we get other investments from across the other parishes.
And that stuff is real. I mean, we've seen that happen across the country with this mushrooming of, Denver does a thing, and then suddenly there's some more communities in Colorado doing it, or something passes in Florida, and then suddenly, over time, you've got 11 counties that have done it. And so that is absolutely part of what we think is the movement building of this stuff. So we're appreciative that United Way of Southeast Louisiana is not stopping with just New Orleans Parish or Orleans Parish. I wanted to go back to this question from Kim Russo about, is anyone coming up against the issue of government believing that philanthropy should be the ones that fund a children's fund solely? And if so, how did you get around that issue? And I just want to say, one of the things we did during COVID is we tracked all of the federal stimulus funding and where it was going, and how, particularly with the most flexible state and local fiscal recovery fund, what were city and county governments deciding, and state governments deciding to do with those funds. And many of them, because of the childcare crisis that's been brought up here, many of them decided to tackle childcare. And it's absolutely become a role of not only local government, but of course, state and federal government need to step up too. But I think we're seeing increasingly that it's an all hands on deck kind of an issue. And so anyone who's, local government doesn't think that's the business they should be in probably needs to look again. And I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that.
I would love to add just a couple things. Connecting back to one of the earlier questions about bringing a board along, one value our board shares is that for us to really achieve our vision, we cannot simply just have transactional funding on that downstream. We need that, but we need to engage in advocacy and policy so that we can change the conditions of the landscape in which we're giving. So there was growing comfort in that. And just like there was a multi-year process with building the board's appetite for politics, we talked a lot about there's this kind of spectrum of activism to community organizing, to advocacy, to policymaking, to politics, and now to implementation, and the different skill sets that philanthropy can bring to each of those. And we need all of that to get to make the changes happen that we need in our world. We had a multi-year process as well with the government, with our local county government, and really built the case probably over 6 years of consistently coming to county council meetings, presenting on community data, making it very hard to argue with the fact that kids and families they're in need of help in our community, helping build the government's understanding of the role they can and should be playing and that moral imperative to do so. And then really strategically embedding in different action plans that council approved over the years, a pursuit of sustainable financing so that we could always thread back and say, you approved last April this plan that said we're going to pursue sustainable financing. Therefore, this is the next step we're taking. So it was hard for them to argue that there wasn't a role because they're the largest sustainable funder, and for many places that's the way that funds have to be administered. So that was our experience.
Thank you.
I would just add Heather's example is powerful. This is long game. This is relationship building. And I think out of the harm of COVID, for someone who's been in this work a long time, there's a greater understanding of the public at large and diverse stakeholders in the role of government as a force for good when it comes for children and youth coming out of COVID. That's something that each of our communities and members of this movement we can build on. We're in a greater place of understanding and strength that the public government can and should be providing these services and can do it well.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
at a scale that no one foundation could possibly ever impact.
So I really want to thank all of you for sharing your stories really honestly and with all of the highs and lows that come with doing this work. I think that you probably have inspired some folks who are sitting in other communities thinking maybe we could do this. And if you are thinking that, please do reach out to Children's Funding Project, and we'd love to help you figure out how to get on that journey. So I don't know that I have anything else, Sarah, unless I've missed a key piece. I know you had a survey there that you wanted folks to fill out.
Yeah, if those of you who are listening in, take a minute before you log off today. Really would appreciate just taking a second to share your thoughts and feedback on today's session. We really do pay attention to what you share, your ideas for what was missing, and what resonated with you. Really would be helpful. But I just want to say a huge thank you to our amazing panelists today, to Todd Batiste, Heather Flaherty, September Jarrett, Trevor Storrs, and Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being a thought partner throughout the planning of this conversation. And you're just incredible moderating today. The way that you seamlessly wove the questions from the attendees into the conversation. I have done this. It is not easy, but you made it look super easy. So thank you so much for that. And huge thank you to all of you who listened in. There was lots of great questions in the Q&A, lots of engagement in the chat as well. So I hope that you were half as inspired as I was. Literally, as I've been planning this conversation, I've been reaching out to some of my local folks, people that I know and local funders here about how we might kind of take what we've learned from the great examples you all shared today and strengthen my local community. So huge personal and professional thank yous. Love to invite all of you to tune back in. We've got some other great sessions coming up later on today. I dropped a link in the chat so that you can learn more about these sessions, but Later this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll have a special session looking at two-generation approaches that are being implemented kind of using housing, both public housing and affordable housing developments as a platform for engaging and supporting whole families. So young children and their parents, youth. So tune in for that. Next week, we'll have another session looking at teacher licensure tests, how we can strengthen those, getting insights from folks from NCTQ, a report, but also Excel and Ed and others, how we can better ensure that there's diversity in the classroom in terms of educators, but also have the skills to teach literacy and early numeracy as well. And then in April, we'll be kicking off the month with another one of our Kindergarten Matters conversations, looking at how we can support the development of children's foundational skills in that in kindergarten and the early grades. And then the Crucible Practice Salon on April 9th will actually be slightly different, shift of plans that happened after I'd produced these slides, but I hope you'll join us for that session on the 9th as well. But also wanted to let everybody know, since this is the funder to funder conversation, we've already got our session locked in for April, and I hope that you will make plans to join us for that. It'll be in partnership with Attendance Works and engaging some national and local funders in conversation about what they are doing to address this crisis of chronic absence in their communities and state level as well. So I hope you'll all join us for that. But then just huge thank you to our panelists again. This was such a fabulous conversation. I could have listened to you for another 90 minutes. But hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, y'all. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Mhm.